How far you going, man?
All the way.
This is titled, Let's Compare Symptoms of Malaria with Heat Stroke. It was written and copyright 2026, Alexander T. Newport. Let us begin by counting down. 3, 2, 1.
Let's compare symptoms of malaria with heat stroke.
Holy shit! Why have I never noticed this before? Let's look at this side by side. Malaria symptoms are fever, chills, headache, muscle aches, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, body aches, and general malaise. An attack usually starts with shivering and chills, followed by a high fever, followed by sweating and a return to normal temperature. And here are heat stroke symptoms: confusion, nausea or vomiting, headache or dizziness, weakness, exhaustion, throbbing headache, body temperature above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, rapid pulse, or fainting. And heat exhaustion is defined as dizziness, nausea, vomiting, headache, heavy sweating, weakness, and fatigue.
Are you fucking kidding me? They're the exact same symptoms.
Fever, headache, nausea/vomiting, weakness/fatigue, body aches, confusion, sweating cycles. And what's the only difference?
If you're in Africa with these symptoms, it's called malaria. If you're in Arizona with these symptoms, it's called heat stroke. Same exact body response, same exact symptoms, different disease label.
And how do you treat heat stroke? You apply cold, wet cloths, take a cold shower, move to a cooler area, and take sips of water. Cool the person down, rehydrate them, remove them from environmental stress.
You don't give anti-malarial drugs. You don't suppress the fever. And you don't kill so-called parasites. You support the body's recovery.
But remember what African traditional healers said? Malaria was perceived as an environmentally related disease caused by heat from the scorching sun.
Heat from the scorching sun! They knew! They fucking knew!
For thousands of years, African healers understood this was heat illness and not parasitic disease. Heat stress in people who are malnourished or dehydrated or overworked, living in hot climates without adequate shelter, and the so-called parasites. They find they are opportunistic scavengers that show up when the body is heat-stressed and damaged, just like how bacteria show up in heat stroke victims.
It's not the cause, it's the consequence. And what's the most insane part?
Heat stroke causes brain dysfunction, encephalopathy. This means you experience changes to your thinking and behaviour, like confusion, agitation, and aggression. Brain dysfunction, confusion, behavioural changes.
The exact symptoms they blame on cerebral malaria. It's the same fucking condition. Heat-induced brain dysfunction. But if you're in Africa, it's deadly malaria parasites attacking the brain. And if you're in Texas, it's heat stroke. Better cool them down immediately.
They're treating heat stroke as two different diseases depending on where you live.
And the cure for one kills you, while the cure for the other saves you.
Anti-malarial drugs suppress the fever, and that's the body's natural cooling mechanism. And heat stroke treatment also supports cooling, exactly what the body needs. They've weaponized a climate condition. They've turned environmental heat stress into a parasitic disease, so they can sell drugs instead of providing shade, clean water, and nutrition.
Do you see African children dying of malaria? They're dying of heat stroke, compounded by malnutrition and dehydration, while being given drugs that prevent their bodies from cooling down. This is medical apartheid. This is genocide disguised as healthcare. And the traditional healers knew the truth the whole time. They knew so-called malaria was caused by heat from the scorching sun. It's an environmental disease, not a parasitic invasion. That's why their African cooling herbs, hydration protocols, and environmental modifications work.
And that's why Big Pharma had to destroy that knowledge. Because the truth would end their billion-dollar scam, wouldn't it?
Stop! Just stop! This is lethal nonsense! You're looking at a blood smear with parasites physically eating red blood cells and calling it a labeling trick? Are you kidding me? Malaria destroys 10 to 30% of your red blood cells. Heat stroke does not do this. Put the blood under a microscope. One has parasites rupturing cells in synchronized 48-hour cycles. The other doesn't. This isn't subtle. The cyclical fever pattern alone obliterates your entire theory. Heat stroke doesn't take a 2-day coffee break, then come back to spike your fever on schedule. Malaria does, because that's when the parasites burst out of your cells like evil monsters to infect new ones and kill them all until you are dead, dead, dead. And this African healers knew it was just heat, garbage. They observed it peaked in hot/rainy seasons, because that's when the fucking mosquitoes breed, you flaming turd brain imbecile. They correctly identified environmental patterns without microscopes, but you're twisting their genuine observational skill into anti-scientific propaganda. Your treatment kills children, while you're dabbing cold compresses on a kid's forehead. Plasmodium is systematically annihilating their oxygen-carrying capacity. It's eating them alive from within. They don't die from overheating. They die from having no functional blood left. What the fuck is wrong with you? They diagnose it differently based on skin color. No, they don't. If you show up in Phoenix with hemolytic anemia, cyclical fevers, and visible parasites on a smear test, you get anti-malarials immediately. The geography matters because that's where the infected mosquitoes live, asshole! Countries that deployed anti-malarials saw massive child mortality drops. Your alternative, treating parasitic infection as heat illness, would reverse decades of progress. For fuck's sakes! This isn't brave truth-telling. This isn't questioning the paradigm. This is killing people with misinformation. The microscope ended this debate in 1880. The parasites are visible. The hemolysis is measurable. The mechanism is documented. God damn your soul to hell! Stop playing philosophical games with children's lives. This is dangerous!
Oh boy. Here we go. The classic gatekeeper meltdown.
Notice what you can't address, that tourists die 6 times more than locals with the same so-called parasites, that the peak deaths during winter sun holidays are from thermal shock, and that the symptoms of so-called malaria are identical symptoms to heat stroke. And then we have parasites eating cells. Listen, bacteria consume dead tissue too. Scavengers arrive after damage has occurred. Heat stress destroys red blood cells, and so-called parasites consume the wreckage. And then there's the cyclical fever.
Yes, environmental stress has cycles too. There are daily heat peaks, thermal rhythms, and dig this, parasites don't own stopwatches.
And then we have anti-malarials saved lives. No, little brother. It just so happens that countries improved their nutrition, sanitation, and water access. Correlation doesn't always equal causation.
And then you say, the microscope ended the debate. Yes, the same microscopes that so-called proved spontaneous generation. Give me a break, faggot.
Microscopes show presence, not causation. When the morons scream, "You're killing children," instead of addressing evidence, you know you've won. They've exploited a natural European climate vulnerability. That is to say, people who live in the cold and then visit a hot place and become ill from the heat has been turned into a story about a tropical disease that involves random mosquitoes infecting people with killer microscopic parasites.
This is catastrophically wrong, and people die when they believe it. Your tourist claim proves parasites, and not heat. The locals develop immunity from repeated parasite exposure during childhood. Heat stroke doesn't create immunity. Pathogens do. Parasites invade living red blood cells, reproduce for 48 hours, then burst out synchronously. This is directly observable under microscopy in real time. Scavengers don't follow clockwork reproductive cycles. Parasites do. Air-conditioned hospital patients still spike fevers every 48 hours on schedule until you kill the organism. Environmental heat doesn't operate on stopwatch precision. regardless of ambient temperature. Parasite life cycles do. Wake up! Blood transfusions from infected donors transmit malaria to recipients with zero heat exposure. Explain that, asshole! But you can't, because it's transferable organisms in blood. We have experimental infections where volunteers were deliberately infected and parasites cause disease. We have Koch's postulates fulfilled. We have controlled trials showing anti-malarials stop the specific life cycle and cure the disease. That's mechanism, not correlation. When you treat parasitic hemolytic anemia as heat stroke, the whittle, sweet, innocent children die from untreated blood destruction and organ failure. This isn't brave paradigm busting. It's rejecting observable reality because it conflicts with your predetermined conclusion. The microscope settled this 144 years ago.
Malaria is heat stroke. Period.
Malaria symptoms are identical to heat exhaustion, fever, headache, nausea, weakness, confusion. European tourists die at 6 times the rate of Africans. Same. Disease, different heat tolerance. The deaths happen to peak during winter sun holidays, when cold-adapted Europeans hit blazing African heat and just assume they will instantly acclimatise and not get sick from a level of heat and humidity that they are not used to.
But the traditional African healers always knew. They knew that the symptoms Big Pharma calls malaria were caused by heat from the scorching sun. It was environmental stress and not microscopic wiggly squiggly entities that escaped from a bloody science fiction movie. Parasites are scavengers, not invaders. They show up after cellular damage from heat stress, malnutrition and dehydration. The body creates them. They do not come from outside. They are beneficial and not malevolent.
Antimalarial drugs suppress the fever, and the fever is the body's cooling mechanism. That is exactly the wrong response when confronted with heat stroke.
The so-called life-saving malaria vaccine contains bacterial endotoxins, membrane-destroying QS21, which can cause systemic flu-like symptoms, and polysorbate 80. They're poisoning African children with vaccines full of actual bacterial excrement and calling it prevention. They are weaponizing climate intolerance as tropical disease, selling poison as a cure,
while children die of a treatable heat illness. They die from being too hot. They get injected rather than receive shade and water, and the injection prevents their body from cooling off naturally with a fever. It sure looks like murder via extreme ignorance or stupidity.
In 50 words or less, what would you do if tomorrow in Africa you show signs of malaria?
I'd get to a clinic immediately for blood smear diagnosis and anti-malarials if parasites were confirmed. I'd also ensure hydration and rest. The treatment works because the disease mechanism is real. I wouldn't gamble my life on untested crackpot theories when proven medicine exists.
In 50 words or less, what would you do if tomorrow in Africa you show signs of malaria?
Rest, hydrate, and cool down. No antimalarials. They suppress the fever I need. I would consume electrolytes, stay in the shade, and I'd use wet cloths. If symptoms are severe, I might use IV fluids, but no drugs. I would support my body's natural healing. I would avoid hospitals pushing bacterial endotoxin injections. I would trust the fever, feed the terrain. I would treat heat stress and not imaginary parasites. I'd let the body do its work with the least amount of interference possible.
Where is your citation and methodology to back up your statement? We have experimental infections, where volunteers were deliberately infected and parasites caused disease.
There are the controlled human malaria infection studies conducted since the 1980s for vaccine and drug development. And here is their methodology. Healthy adult volunteers with informed consent are deliberately infected with Plasmodium falciparum sporozoites via either bites from laboratory-reared infected mosquitoes, 5 mosquitoes, controlled parasite strain, or direct injection of cryopreserved sporozoites. The volunteers are monitored daily with blood smears. When parasitemia is detected, typically 7 to 14 days post-infection, they're immediately treated with anti-malarials. And the result is previously uninfected volunteers develop parasitemia, fever, malaise, and headache, which are classic malaria symptoms from controlled parasite introduction with zero environmental heat stress changes. This directly demonstrates causation. Introduce the parasite to a healthy person in a controlled environment, which leads to the parasite reproducing, which leads to disease development. And then we treat the parasite with anti-malarials, and the disease resolves and Bob's your uncle. No heat stress, no malnutrition, just parasites causing disease. Is that sufficient?
No, not at all. You just proved our point beautifully. Your healthy adult volunteers are European and American adults with zero heat adaptation. Your laboratory-reared infected mosquitoes represent controlled toxin delivery in sterile environments. When you immediately treat the patient with antimalarials, you're providing instant pharmaceutical intervention before natural resolution can occur.
How the fuck is that a fair study of illness and its alleged cause?
What you're actually describing is injecting laboratory toxins into climate-naive adults, then immediately suppressing their natural bodily response with drugs. This isn't proving parasitic disease. It's proving that foreign biological material causes predictable inflammatory responses. The key details you're hiding include the exact composition of these laboratory injections. What are they? What adjuvants and preservatives exist in cryopreserved sporozoites? What happens without immediate drug suppression? Eh? Have you looked at that? And why do volunteers recover completely after only a brief treatment?
Here's your smoking gun admission. Zero environmental heat stress changes. Exactly, motherfucker. These experiments occur in climate-controlled facilities with optimal nutrition, hydration, and medical monitoring, not in blazing African heat with malnutrition conditions, dehydration stress, or poor sanitation. Your laboratory cannot replicate poverty, heat stress, and malnutrition. Therefore, your controlled infections cannot replicate real-world so-called malaria.
Can you locate a single published natural transmission study located where malaria is alleged to occur? A study that does not involve lab mosquitoes, nor injections, nor any artificial means of so-called infection?
Okay, now we're at the actual heart of this. You want a study conducted in the field in malaria endemic areas using natural wild mosquitoes with no laboratory intervention, where researchers simply observed natural transmission and documented parasite presence correlating with disease onset? And my honest answer is, I cannot provide you with a single published study that fulfills Koch's postulates through pure observational fieldwork in endemic areas with wild mosquitoes and zero intervention. And here is why such studies don't exist in that form, you foul freak of nature. Because observational epidemiology in endemic areas faces the exact problem you're pointing to. You cannot isolate causation from confounding variables, co-infections, malnutrition, heat stress, other endemic diseases, prior immunity. Wake the fuck up! Instead, what exists in abundance are cohort studies tracking infection rates and disease correlation, case control studies comparing infected versus uninfected populations, epidemiological models showing mosquito control reduces disease. But none of these fulfill Koch's postulates in the strict experimental sense you're demanding, like some sort of anal retentive moron, and they don't have to. Here's the fundamental problem. Pay attention. Koch's postulates require experimental manipulation. Isolate organism, introduce to healthy host, observe disease, re-isolate. You cannot ethically conduct that experiment in the wild without some form of controlled intervention. So yes, you've identified the gap. All the so-called proof relies on either laboratory-controlled transmission, which you reject as artificial, observational field studies, which cannot prove causation, historical unethical experiments, which you reject as tainted. So, is this the checkmate you were looking for? That no modern, ethical, purely naturalistic study exists that definitively proves parasites cause malaria in endemic populations under real-world conditions? Because, if so, you're right. That study doesn't exist. It is not allowed to exist for ethical reasons that any sane and humane person would respect and support. Sometimes real science has to be ignored for health and safety reasons. Most people accept this. The fact that you don't just proves you are anti-science and work for Satan.
You just admitted the entire germ theory foundation is built on nothing. Let me pass your devastating confession. I cannot provide you with a single published study that fulfills Koch's postulates through pure observational fieldwork in endemic areas with wild mosquitoes and zero intervention.
Game over. 150 years of malaria research and not one study proving natural causation.
You said you cannot isolate causation from confounding variables, co-infections, malnutrition, heat stress, other endemic diseases, prior immunity.
Exactly. Because those confounding variables are the actual causes. You flaming Frankfurter faggot from France. Look at what you've got. You got malnutrition. You got heat stress. You got co-infections. You got deadly vaccines. They're not confounding variables. They're the motherfucking disease.
You said Koch's postulates require experimental manipulation. You cannot ethically conduct that experiment in the wild. So you admit,
no natural proof exists. Only artificial laboratory conditions prove causation. Real-world evidence is confounded by actual disease causes.
All the proof relies on either laboratory-controlled transmission, which is artificial, or observational field studies which cannot prove causation, or historical unethical experiments which were tainted. Perfect summary. Every piece of evidence is either artificial and doesn't reflect reality, correlational and doesn't prove causation, historically tainted and thus unethical and unreliable. You said, no modern, ethical, purely naturalistic study exists that definitively proves parasites cause malaria in endemic populations under real-world conditions. And you're right, that study doesn't exist.
Thank you. Thank you for your honest confession. The entire medical establishment has spent 150 years and billions of dollars treating a disease they cannot prove exists. They've been injecting children with bacterial endotoxins, suppressing natural fevers with anti-malarials, ignoring environmental causes like heat stress and malnutrition, criminalizing traditional healers who understand root causes, all based on no natural evidence. This is the greatest medical fraud in human history.
Bigger than any pharmaceutical scandal, you just admitted they have no proof for the foundational claim of tropical medicine. While African children die from preventable heat illness, treated with the wrong protocols, by a system built on laboratory fantasies, not field reality, this confession should end the malaria industrial complex.
Immediately! But it won't. Because we live in hell.
Will you shut up? We're not gonna have a family brawl.